All right, so let's jump right in. You know, those Biden-Trump meetings,
Yeah.
everyone's been talking about them, those seemingly, cordial encounters
Right.
between the current president and his predecessor. And I know you're really into keeping up with, all things politics.
Always.
And given your, emoji reactions to the news lately, I got the sense that a deep dive was in order.
It's definitely a very unique situation.
Mm,
We have all these news articles covering two separate meetings
right.
that kind of bookend a really pivotal moment.
Exactly. It's not just two guys bumping into each other, at the coffee shop.
Right.
First, we have that formal White House meeting right during that transition period.
Yeah.
When Biden first took office, and then boom, fast forward.
Right, to the G20.
The recent G20 summit in Peru.
Yeah.
Now Biden's the president, and we've got Trump back on the campaign trail vying for the very seat that Biden's sitting in.
The fact that these two meetings happened within such a short time span really highlights how unusual this period is in American politics.
Okay, so let's unpack that first meeting, the one during the transition.
Okay.
It was interesting to see how many sources pointed out that Trump didn't really offer Biden the same courtesy back in 2020.
Yeah.
It just adds another layer to the whole thing.
Smooth transitions of power are really important in a democracy.
Yeah.
Kind of like the passing of the torch. This meeting, regardless of the actual tone or content, reinforces that tradition, even though it didn't happen 4 years ago.
And then there's that welcome back quote from Biden to Trump. It was like someone threw a political grenade right into the media.
Oh, yeah.
Some news sources, especially those leaning, a certain way, they ate it up. They loved Biden's grace.
Right.
Others, they saw it as awkward, maybe even a little ironic.
You have to think about the timing of that meeting, though.
Yeah.
It happened right before Trump went to Capitol Hill.
Wait, are you suggesting that Biden might have been trying to, pull the rug out from under Trump, so to speak? To diminish any influence that Trump might have hoped to exert on lawmakers?
That's an interesting point to consider.
Yeah.
It was a subtle play, for sure, if that was the intention.
Pretty slick, if you ask me.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we've got this potentially strategic move from Biden, all happening within the context of a peaceful transition of power.
Right.
But then the media is spinning it every which way, and then bam, we're at the G20 summit.
Right.
World leaders are all gathered, and suddenly you have these two major figures from the same country.
Yeah.
One, the current president, and the other trying to replace him. Did that create tension, do you think?
It definitely adds a layer of complexity, especially with Trump being back in campaign mode.
Right.
But you can't forget the larger context here. The G20 is where, these major global players are trying to hash out critical issues.
Right.
Things like the economy, global security, climate change even.
It's not just domestic politics.
Exactly. It's about global leadership.
Right. The whole world is watching. But so much of the coverage seemed to zero in on Biden and Xi Jinping's interactions with Trump. Almost like this shadow.
Right.
Yeah.
Looming in the background.
Yeah. It is fascinating how some outlets chose to downplay Trump's presence, focusing instead on those, high-stakes international discussions.
Almost like they were saying, look, this is where the real action is.
Right.
But that feels a little misleading, right? Like they're deliberately minimizing the potential impact of having a former president now running again present at this high-profile global event.
Yeah, it almost feels like they're trying to control the narrative.
Exactly.
It raises a lot of questions about how the media chooses to frame events like this and what information they think should be prioritized.
Okay, so we have these two meetings, each with its own unique dynamic, and they both get the media spin treatment.
Yeah.
The first meeting highlights that transfer of power and maybe some political maneuvering going on underneath.
Right.
The second one takes place on a global stage with, potentially global implications.
And it's all happening against the backdrop of a very divided political landscape.
Yeah.
Back here in the U.S.
Speaking of division.
Let's talk about the media coverage itself.
Right.
We've got everything from established sources like the New York Times and the BBC,
Right.
to some more opinionated outlets like Fox News and The Hill. It's like they're covering entirely different events.
Well, that's where media bias comes in.
Oh, yeah.
It's not just about presenting the facts. It's about how those facts are presented, the language they use, the angle they choose.
Even with the same basic facts, the headlines can be drastically different.
Yeah.
I remember one source described the White House meeting as a tense standoff,
Right.
while another one called it a cordial exchange.
Same meeting, two different interpretations.
Exactly.
And that's where you, as a listener, you need to engage your critical thinking skills.
Okay.
It's about understanding that every source Every single source has a perspective.
Even if it's not explicitly stated.
Right.
So it's not just about reading the headlines, it's about reading between the lines,
Yes.
understanding the potential biases, and piecing the puzzle together yourself.
Exactly. And that's what we're here to help you do.
Awesome.
We're going to dissect the language that they use, the way these meetings are framed, and explore what could be, the potential implications of these different narratives.
Sounds like we've got a lot to unpack.
We do.
But before we dive into, all the nitty-gritty of the news coverage, let's take a quick detour
Okay.
to the world of satire. Remember those SNL skits?
Oh, yeah.
Mocking both these meetings.
They were hilarious.
They're so funny.
But comedy can be a really powerful tool.
Yeah.
Those skits, while meant to entertain, also show a certain public perception
Right.
or anxieties about these really unusual encounters.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork.
Yeah, we have these two meetings,
A media frenzy.
a media frenzy, and even some comedic commentary.
Perfect.
Let's move on to part 2,
Sounds good.
where we really dig into the nuances of all this news coverage.
Okay.
And really explore how these narratives, how they shape our understanding of what happened.
I'm ready.
Welcome back.
All right, so we've established, the media's having a field day with these meetings.
Oh, yeah.
Spinning the story every which way.
Yeah.
Where do we even begin to untangle this mess?
Well, let's start with that first meeting
Oh.
at the White House.
Okay.
Some outlets, particularly those leaning, conservative,
Right.
they really played up Trump's, willingness to meet with Biden,
Yeah.
painting it as, a gesture of goodwill, highlighting his commitment to that peaceful transition of power.
But doesn't that kind of ignore the fact that Trump spent weeks, challenging the election results? It feels like they're skipping over a big part of the story.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
It really shows how some outlets will downplay, certain aspects that don't fit their narrative.
Right.
Then you have the more left-leaning sources they focused on. The, awkwardness of the whole thing.
Yeah.
Questioning if Trump was even being sincere.
They kept bringing up the fact that he still hadn't conceded the election.
Right.
Even calling the meeting a, choreographed photo op. It's like two completely different interpretations.
It's a classic example of how media bias can really shape how the public sees things.
It's like two separate conversations happening at the same time.
It is.
So how do we, as, people consuming all this information, how do we figure out, what to trust?
Well, it's not about blindly trusting anyone.
Right.
It's about recognizing that every source has its own angle, its own way of framing the story. And that's where you got to use your critical thinking.
Okay.
We need to analyze the language they're using, what they choose to emphasize,
Right.
what they include, what they leave out.
So it's not just about, reading the headlines. It's about going deeper, questioning the source, and looking for the little clues that reveal the bias.
Exactly. For instance, let's look at how they talked about the G20 meeting.
Okay.
Some outlets, they use words like confrontation,
Right.
rivalry.
Yeah, when they described Biden and Trump together,
Yeah,
it was like they were setting up, this big political showdown.
right. And then other outlets used, exchange, interaction, downplaying any conflict.
Yeah.
The language makes a huge difference.
It does.
It changes how the reader sees the relationship between the two.
So it's not just about, straight up lies. It's about those subtle choices,
Yes.
the framing, the tone.
All of it can sway opinions.
So we need to be looking at news from a variety of sources.
Yes, expose yourself to different perspectives.
Yeah.
Build those critical thinking muscles.
It's like, cross-checking your sources to make sure you're getting the full picture.
Absolutely. Now, let's talk about those SNL skits for a second.
Oh, yeah.
They were funny, but they also show how the public feels.
Right.
The fact that they decided to make fun of these meetings, it means those meetings, hit a nerve with people.
They were hilarious.
But, sometimes humor is a way of dealing with things that are complex or even uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I think in this case, the humor comes from how absurd the whole thing is.
Yeah.
These two larger-than-life figures both want power, and they're forced to, interact on the world stage.
It's perfect for comedy.
It is, and it also shows how fascinated people are with all this political drama.
We can't look away,
I know.
even when we're laughing at it.
It speaks to how much power these figures have and how much influence they still have, even when they aren't in office.
Yeah, their actions, their words, just them being there, it all shapes the political landscape.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've analyzed the media coverage, broken down the language, and even talked about the comedy. What does it all mean? What's the big picture?
It shows how divided things are politically,
Right.
where information is being used as a weapon
Yeah.
and perception is carefully controlled.
So these meetings, they seem like simple encounters,
Right.
but the media turns them into something bigger.
Yeah,
It all shakes public opinion and adds fuel to the political fire.
it does.
It feels like we're always being bombarded with information, but to really understand it, you have to, look for the truth behind the noise,
You said it.
analyze the sources, and think critically about, what we're being told.
Exactly. And that's what's important for our listener.
Okay.
As we go into part 3, we're going to look at, what these meetings could mean and what they tell us about the future of U.S. politics.
Okay. And hopefully we can give our listener the tools to understand this complex landscape and
Yeah.
come to their own conclusions.
Yes.
All right. So we've spent all this time, dissecting these meetings,
Yeah.
looking at the media coverage, and even, checking out the comedy.
Right.
But let's get to the big question.
Okay.
The so what?
Yeah, that's so what?
What could these meetings, between Biden and Trump, what could they tell us about where U.S. politics is headed?
That's the big question, isn't it? I mean, are these meetings a sign that they might cooperate?
Yeah.
Like a glimmer of hope in, this divided world?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it just, the same old political games?
On the surface, it seems good, right?
Yeah.
At least they're in the same room shaking hands talking. That's more than we saw just a few years ago.
True. You could definitely say that even those little symbolic gestures are important.
Yeah.
Especially now when everything's so polarized.
Right.
Maybe it's a first step,
Yeah. Towards something more.
Yeah. But you can't just focus on how things look.
So what should we be watching for? What would show us that it's real progress and not just, a political show?
Actions.
Right.
Actions speak louder than words. We need to see results.
Okay.
Did any, bipartisan laws come out of these meetings?
Right.
For the things they talked about? Were there any real policy changes that show they're actually willing to compromise?
That's a good point. It's easy to get caught up in the media hype and what these meetings represent.
It is.
But what really matters is what happens after.
Exactly.
What they do, it changes.
And don't forget about the, what other countries think.
Right.
These meetings, especially the G20, weren't just for Americans.
Right. The world is watching.
The world was watching.
So how does this affect America's, place on the world stage? Does a divided America look weak?
Absolutely. Global leadership needs a united front. When you're fighting amongst yourselves,
Yeah.
it makes other countries think you're not reliable.
Like a house divided,
Exactly. And with all the problems the world's facing right now,
Yeah.
the U.S. needs to be a strong leader that other countries can depend on.
Right.
These meetings and all the media craziness around them,
Right.
they make people wonder if America can really do that.
Okay, so lots to think about.
Yeah.
We've got the possibility of them working together,
Yeah.
but also the chance that they just keep fighting.
Right.
It affects us here and it affects the whole world. What should our listener keep in mind as they, keep following this?
The most important thing is to be careful.
Okay.
Don't let the media tell you what to think.
Right.
Analyze the information, question what they're telling you, and look for real results.
Okay.
Do those, those false steps actually turn into something meaningful? That's how you know if there's real progress.
So it's not just about what happens in those meetings.
No.
It's about what happens next.
Yes.
It's about looking past the headlines and the photos and seeing what they actually do.
Exactly. And remember, politics is tricky.
Yeah.
There are always, hidden things and different people wanting different things.
Right.
The more you know, the better you'll understand it all.
Well, I think we've given our listener a lot to think about.
I feel.
We've explored these meetings every which way.
Oh, yeah?
Analyzed what happened, what the media said, and, what it all could mean.
It's been really interesting.
It has.
It's crazy how these simple meetings can tell us so much about, the state of the world, how power works, and how hard it is to deal with politics that are always changing.
And to our listener, we leave you with these meetings, however you see them, they're just one moment in time.
Yeah.
The story's not over. Keep learning, keep paying attention, and most importantly, stay involved.